And the other thing then that demographers and population historians are interested in is looking at and comparing their set with different sets, okay? So you either compare one set with another across time, okay, 1901 to the 1911 census, did we notice any change that takes place here? Maybe you want to compare one area with another area, urban and rural, say, within a particular parish, okay? And maybe another a different place altogether, okay? So somewhere County Kerry and County Antrim, or a different country. What's happening in Ireland in the 1920s? Let's look at Poland, Catholic country, but European, very, very different cultural milieu, political environment as well. How has Catholicism fared? It seems they're very similar countries. So you see quite a lot of comparisons of Ireland and Poland in that kind of thing. So this whole issue of typicality and comparison is really the bread and butter for this kind of collective study of the family. And finally, then, the demographer thrives on numbers and counting. In essence, that's what the heart and soul of demography is. It's statistical analysis of numbers. But as Leslie Clarkson, who I don't know if you've ever come across his work at all, the former professor of social history at Queen's, who's really a wonderful writer and so observant, says, anybody can count. Really, it's just how high you want to, how big your counting is going to be and how fancy you want to get at analyzing the numbers that you've counted. And he's absolutely right. So counting is easy and it's something that we can all do. But hopefully I'll show you a few of the pitfalls that counting can lead to when we get further on. But demographers always try then to contextualize the quantitative data that they've collected from a variety of different sources by using qualitative data. Okay, and together to try and arrive at a full picture of a particular community or a particular set of households. Now, demographers have developed a number of concepts that they use to help them understand what populations do when they are, as they live. And another term I could have put up there, I guess, would be life cycle. Okay, if you think of the life cycle of an individual from birth through infancy to childhood, to young adulthood, to full adulthood, to marriage, to family formation, to then old age, to eventual death, then this is what we consider to be the human life cycle. And so at various stages, the demographer can come along and intervene and try and analyze, okay? Well, what happens to older people in, the early 21st century? How are they treated by society? Are there measures that we can look at that will indicate, how this happened across society as a whole, for example? So one of the hugest concepts, really, that demographers deal with is the concept of fertility. And that's really how many children a woman has in a particular marriage. And if we talk about fertility rates going up, or we're talking about fertility rates declining, we're really talking about whether or not there is changes in society which are allowing women, or which are encouraging women to have more children, or to have fewer children. So again, a really basic conclusion that everybody would recognize is that the 2.4 children average that we would have today is very, very different from the average that you would have gotten in the mid-19th century, where for Protestants and Catholics alike, the family size would have been, family size was on average about between 4 and 5, so you had a healthy number of families then that would have been 5 or more. The other concept then that they deal with is mortality, and this is in essence the death rate. How many people die in a particular area per 100. And you can measure it then in accordance with the number of births. So if the birth rate is going up and increasing, people are having more children, your population grows. If you have a high mortality rate, your population declines. Okay? Sometimes the mortality rates and the fertility rates can cancel each other out. Okay, so what demographers spend a lot of time doing is trying to work out which one of these is causing population growth or decline. Demographers also like to talk about this thing called labor participation rates. And what that means is that how many people within the population are employed for cash wages. Because because you will find that obviously in today's day and age, lots of people are unemployed. So labor participation rates, you might argue, would be, well, what, about 80% potentially, which seems very high. I would imagine it's probably much lower. But labor participation rates really means it's the number of people who are actually getting paid and actively participating then within the economy. And in certain societies and in certain places, the labor participation rate, say for women, would be hardly anything at all. Women wouldn't have been encouraged to have jobs or to work. And so some demographers are very interested in looking at what are the factors that influence participation in the labor market. And are there any obstacles to that kind of participation? And then another sort of characteristic of what demographers are interested in is the issue of gender or class. Okay? Now when we talk about gender, we're talking about whether or not the factor or the value that we're looking at is influenced by whether or not you're a man or a woman. So labor participation is a really good one to illustrate that. Okay? So in the 19th century, women's participation in labor would have been very low because the society did not encourage them or feel it was suitable or appropriate for women to have waged employment. Okay? So for women then, their gender is a fundamental influence on their participation and their working experiences. So when demographers find women working in the 19th century, they pounce on those statistics. And they're very keen to find out why those are. And we'll talk a bit more about women working in a minute. And the same thing is true for class. And when we talk about class, what we're really talking about is the differences between rich and poor. Okay? Upper class people who have lots of money will have certain ways of acting and behaving than people who are poor. Okay? So the gender differential in terms of labor participation is much greater for upper class women than it is for working class women. Okay? And you should all totally have understood what I just said, even though I use really big words. Right? Because all I really said was that nobody had a problem with working class women who were married working in the 19th century, but it was a much bigger social problem for women from the upper classes. Okay? And you see a strong class distinction then in terms of women's work in the 19th century, with far more working class women working for cash wages and hardly any upper class women doing so. All right? So all of these are it's all very interesting. So, but before your eyes cross with the theory of it all, I thought we would maybe take a little bit of time and just sort of do just a brief narrative of kind of where demographers are in terms of population history in general, and the kind of the standard narrative of the family in Britain. Okay, so this is the story that most historians would kind of have in the back of their minds and use as a fundamental assumption. Okay? Now, if you go back to medieval times, historians and demographers would say that we in sort of so-called British Isles would have had a number of assumptions about how our family would operate. Okay? So the assumption is that within Britain, which would have been obviously is including all of the four nations, is the dominance of the nuclear family. Okay? The parents and the children living within a single household. There would have also been the acceptance that marriage was for life. And that you didn't take other wives on the way. That marriage was something that happened after puberty. Okay, and again, you can see we're making these distinctions as opposed to other societies in the world which have very different customs and approaches towards family formation, where you would have, people marrying before the age of puberty, very, very young, where you might have additional wives being thoroughly acceptable, and where you would have had much wider extended family networks as the norm, okay? But within Britain then, you've got these sorts of characteristics. And again, the notion of little wider kin loyalty, okay? So just because someone has the name of Holmes and I read about them in the newspaper as being broken in jail, it doesn't mean I'm about to run off and rescue them because they have my same last name. So I don't have much kin loyalty to strangers with my last name. Some societies have much greater, okay? And certainly in medieval times, this kind of kin loyalty operated much more broadly. And then finally, two more terms, I suppose, which is the way in which we inherit property, or we did anyway, which was that property from the landed classes was inherited by a primogenitor, which means that the eldest son inherits, okay? As opposed to the system of inheritance, which is called gavelkind, which meant that the land would have been distributed amongst all of the sons. Okay, so this was kind of the basic assumptions of how families and populations operated in sort of medieval times. And population didn't really grow all that much until really about the 18th century, when in Britain as a whole the population begins to increase. And much of this is attributed by demographers to a tendency on the part of the population as a whole to start to marry earlier and to marry younger. And they also attribute it to falling mortality rates with the rise in living standards. Okay, so in essence, infant mortality is one of the strongest indicators of a poor society. So if your infant mortality rates are declining, then it's a sign that society is becoming better off. And things. But what was also happening was the impact of industrialization, the onset of textile machines and factories, was having a real impact on family working life. Okay, we can all envisage or imagine the family unit working and living all together in the same place. But with the onset of the factory, the family life was fundamentally transformed in many parts of Britain, as the father would go out to work, potentially the mother too, and the home then became a very different place than it had been before. So in the late 18th and early 19th centuries then, you have a fundamental transformation of the way in which work and home interact, which has lots of implications for the way we consider and think about families and people. Now this narrative, okay, slow, steady population, big, rapid growth in the 18th century, is similar in Ireland, but it's exacerbated. The growth in population is much stronger in the 18th century, and Ireland is one of the fastest growing populations in the late 18th, early 19th century. And until about the 1820s, when the population begins to stabilize, and then in the 1840s, with the onset of the famine, we all know then there's a drastic and dramatic drop in the population. And this decline in Ireland's population continues throughout the post-famine years, up until about the sort of the 1920s. And really, that decline is a result of continuing high levels of Irish immigration between 1850 and 1920. So even though mortality rates are falling and even though the birth rate is picking up again, the amount of immigration is so high to cream off all of those increases so that you're still left with a net fall in population throughout the late 19th century. Okay, so Irish population is quite distinctive in that sense and doesn't really follow the European model very well.